Recording in progress.
I feel it's been a while since I've done my last video, and I wanted to recognize that I spent a bit of time trying to formulate this topic of gender identity and how I wanted to have it presented. There's a lot of detail that goes into this concept, and as usual, you can go back to my other videos and look at my credentials and references, but let's get into gender identity. First thing I wanted to talk about was the definition. An individual's internal sense of being male, female, some combination of male, female, or neither male or female. And that's great. Here's the definition. It's very simple in of itself, but it doesn't give you a lot of information or background detail of where they came up with this concept. It seems to be vague in some places, and a lot of people look at this and say, well, male, female, some combination or neither. How does that work? Um, and a lot of it stems from that previous discussion on sexes and how the evolution of our understanding of sexes and genetics and recognizing a person as a whole entity, depending on various structures that may or may not be present, or their genetics or their chromosomes. There's a lot of things that are dived or delved into with the human and the body itself, and also with mentation. And I will take that into this next slide. And you've seen me pull this diagram up before, mind, body, and spirit. And I like this concept because it simplifies out what I'm trying to get at. And we focus on body, mind, spirit, and these relationships with one another. We try to improve our spirituality, improve our physical health, improve our mental health. And we do that through various means of balancing out each one of these pathways. The challenge with this is some individuals have limitations that are placed on them, either through genetics or through events through life, or trauma, things like that, that influence these various relationships between body and mind, mind and spirit, spirit and body, and vice versa, all throughout this. And over to the left, I actually listed a group of medical conditions that interrupt these relationships between body and mind, mind and spirit, and so on. And I'm going to highlight a few of these and kind of pull them into this relationship under the diagram over to the right. And the first one I wanted to point out is stroke. As a physician working as a hospitalist, I deal with stroke patients very frequently. And there's various types of stroke. There's hemorrhagic, there's ischemic, and there's various subtypes underneath that as well. The one that I wanted to highlight a little bit is where we have these mini strokes that happen over time. And this relates down to the next one below it, which is dementia, where they have this description of vascular dementia, which is these tiny little strokes that develop and evolve over time, but not necessarily overtly evident with people, having slurred speech, the drop of the mouth, the inability to move extremities and things like that. Sometimes these are very obscure and notoriously difficult to diagnose at the point of them happening. But what family members usually notice is a change in their ability to function, whether it's a development of memory issues or whether it's more obvious with behavior changes. These individuals that do develop stroke do change over time. Um, they become more forgetful. They become a little bit more anxious. They become hyper aware of their surroundings. They become very regimented in their habits. And we see that with kind of early on dementia, is that people become very regimented in their routine so that they don't forget things that they need to do. So they consistently put their keys in one spot. They put their purse in one spot. They wake up at habitually at a certain time. They place all their things in very neat, orderly places to keep themselves in from forgetting. You'll see that with them driving a car, they go back and forth to the store, and that's all they do because as soon as they go farther than that, they lose that familiarity. Um, the next one down with Parkinson's is a movement disorder. And as you link these up in associations with the body and the mind, think about it this way. If the mind is affected with a stroke, maybe it is like paralysis, maybe that vascular dementia does lead to difficulties with speech impediments and things. Parkinson's is again another relationship between mind and body where the mind, the nervous system doesn't function the way it's supposed to. And they get this typical pattern of the cogwheel rigidity. They do develop dementia over time called Parkinson's dementia. Lewy body dementia is characterized by behavior changes, but it's not even just things that can develop over the course of a lifetime. These are medical conditions that happen, stroke, dementia, just in the course of somebody's life. These events do happen. What about somebody with cerebral palsy? Somebody who is born with a difficulty of nerve connections between the mind and the body. So, in a concept, it's similar to stroke in the fact that there's a disconnect between the mind and the body, but it has more obvious influences at birth. And cerebral palsy can lead to developmental delays. It can cause impairments and impediments of extremities, sensory issues. It can have all sorts of influences on the body. Um, and I can carry that down into developmental delay. The next one is one that we've been seeing a lot of autism, this neurodivergent individual that interacts with the world in a different way than neurotypical individuals. And as somebody who's also very familiar with those who have autism on the autism spectrum, these people interact with senses differently than you and I. So touch is different. So they may be hypersensitive or not sensitive to touch or sensations. Noise can become a heavy burden to them, or they can get sensory overload from trying to process too many things at once. So oftentimes you will see these individuals or children running around with headphones on to mitigate the sensory overload. So again, it's coming down to this relationship between mind and body. It's not even just those things. Brain trauma, injury. We all go back to that historical, maybe we experience this in psychology where there's that one individual who was mining and working with dynamite and was hitting the dynamite, tampanating it down with a rod, and unfortunately exploded and went up through his brain. He survived, but destroyed his frontal lobe. And as a consequence of that event, people around him clearly saw a personality change. And a lot of our understanding and interest in diving into these individuals maybe it stems from that event. Other things that do happen when somebody comes into the hospital with a severe infection of their lower extremity, maybe it's gangrene, maybe it's necrotizing fasciitis that just got to the point where, unfortunately, the treatment of choice is to amputate that extremity. Afterwards, the mind still recognizes or tries to recognize that there is an extremity there. The body doesn't have it there, but again, that relationship between mind and body is altered. There are other things that can affect this as well: medications, seizures, heart failure, renal failure. Chronic pain is one that's really interesting and one that I think people can relate to a lot. People with chronic pain unfortunately experience complications because of in the mind. They become depressed. They become limited with their mobility and interaction with other individuals. People with a significant amount of pain can become quiet and withdrawn from the rest of society. And with those social losses, it can get worse and worse and worse, and again lead to depression and anxiety. So even people who are unfortunately opioid dependent or they have a substance use disorder, these interactions between the mind and body and ultimately even the spirit can be heavily influenced. Now, I touch mainly on the medical side of things, but again, this comes into play of how does the spirit interact with the mind? How does the spirit interact with the body? From an osteopathic standpoint, We look at the person as a whole, and our spiritual aspects really are important as part of this. We do have some spiritual experiences throughout our life. Now, some people review those differently than other people. Some, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, and other religions in the midst of all this, they may view themselves more from the earth, more from the heavens. Some people look at the Quran, some people look at the Bible. There's a lot of things that we look at as individuals, and that does influence our experience in mind and learning. It also influences our body with the things that we take into our bodies in of itself. So the concept with this is I wanted to present a whole bunch of medical conditions related to this overarching diagram and recognize that, yes, we see mind, body, and spirit, but primarily looking at the relationships between each one of those concepts. So, human life and development from birth to death involves constant learning to interact and behave with an ever changing and dynamic physical body. And we experience that throughout our entire lives, from birth to the infancy to childhood to teenage years to puberty to adulthood to maturation and to age related conditions. Any one of those events can carry a lot of consequences and medical conditions. Family members who have genetic issues, disorders, can attest to this very readily. Um, our entire life is recognizing and working with a dynamic physical body. Those who have had a stroke have to learn to compensate for the event that just happened. And we try to restore as much as we possibly can through physical therapy, occupational therapy, medications to prevent a future stroke from happening. And then one of the other concepts behind this is we like to compartmentalize topics to aid in our learning and understanding. Oftentimes, we look at mind as one collection. In the past, we saw psychiatry as a separate specialty than internal medicine. As we have gone into the current present day, we have found that, well, we actually need to overlap a lot of these medical conditions into various subspecialties and fields. Cardiology relates to pulmonology. Nephrology relates to cardiology. Neurology relates to cardiology, and so on and so forth. Psychiatry is not necessarily a separate entity, but one that relates very much and intimately to a lot of medicine that's going on. And again, it comes back to recognizing that there are these medical conditions that relate to this diagram. And we do this also in our evolutionary process as humans. We take algebra, algebra relates to calculus, engineering relates to physics. We learn and grow through these various topics. As we learn in high school, we take on various subjects that are interest to us, and we find that some things do relate to others as well. Art can relate to music. Music can relate to art. Music relates to mathematics. There's so many things that interact, but to help in our learning and understanding, we do compartmentalize things to make it easier for us to comprehend. So this leads to the topic or the discussion of gender identity. And a lot of times, gender identity becomes apparent with human variation. Gender identity is part of our overall identity, is a relationship between our mind and body. And I'm going to add in spirit into the midst of that as well. Now, because spirit is a more nebulous topic, we need to kind of focus more on the mind and body. Again, as we talked about these other various conditions, how the mind interacts with the body is exactly where gender identity comes into play. If there is a congruence of mind and body, then our physical sex and gender identity are in sync. Gender dysphoria is a distress in that relationship between mind and body, that there is some mechanism, just like cerebral palsy or depression and things like that, things that interrupt that relationship between our mind and our body that leads to this concept of gender identity and gender dysphoria. And I have a link here that goes off to an article. And throughout this whole entire discussion, I have a lot of links placed in each one of these slides. I will make this available online. So I've talked a lot about sexes, variations in sexual development, and a lot of these ideas that it's more complicated than just saying straight up male and female. The definition of male and female is more involved than just saying chromosomes or sex structures or internal or external anatomy or chromosomes or hormones. It's a collection of all of these things, and that there are indeed variations of these. At the very top, I place Klinefelter syndrome because that's the one that seems to be more recognizable for a lot of individuals. Klinefelter's is an individual with XXY chromosomes, and I have here linked a journal article that describes that these individuals do have a higher risk of developing gender dysphoria. Not always. Typically speaking, a Klinefelter individual will grow up as male and identify as male. Oftentimes, they do have problems with infertility, and you will find that a Klinefelter's individual will be involved with a fertility clinic if they want to have children. However, there's a sizable portion of these individuals who experience gender dysphoria, even despite the fact that they do have a lot of male structures. The next one down is an interesting one called Kallman syndrome. And this link right here is a case study of an individual with Kallman syndrome. And Kallman syndrome is a condition that involves the pituitary gland. During gestation, the signals that tell the brain to develop the pituitary gland to send cells to the pituitary don't quite make it. And unfortunately, this also can involve the nasal placoid, which also it leads to the secondary effect of Kallman syndrome individuals having a lack of smell or anosmia. That's not always the case. The other name behind this condition is called congenital hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. But this case report describes an individual with Kallman syndrome who has gender dysphoria. And personally speaking, I have seen individuals where they are an XY individual that is assigned female at birth. This individual grew up with gender dysphoria, not understanding why, and it wasn't until they got genetic testing did they realize that this individual indeed has XY chromosomes and not necessarily full female structures as well. So there's a lot of variation in between all of this. Androgen sensitivity is another one that frequently can be brought up as well. Androgen insensitivity has to do with the androgen receptor inside the body. And there's androgen receptors throughout the body, including the brain. And this can lead to feminization of the brain. If people are lucky, it can be masculinization. There's such variation in how we develop that gender dysphoria can be part of a person's experience with differences of sexual development, which is the next topic down. The last two key points on this one is I talk about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and schizophrenia. And Ehlers-Danlos is a condition of connective tissue, and there's an increased risk of gender dysphoria with these individuals. And that seems an interesting kind of concept because when we think of Ehlers-Danlos, we think of this hyperflexibility. They're very tall. They can have problems with their heart or structures, vascular structures, and they can have complications because of that. Ehlers-Danlos, because of its difficulty with connective tissue, that connective tissue is also involved with the brain and how it develops. So, as a consequence of that, the mechanism may not be fully understood, but because the connective tissue is involved, there is a clear mechanism that could lead to that. Schizophrenia is considered a psychiatric condition, but there is a very strong familial and genetic origin to schizophrenia. And gender dysphoria is a part of individuals with schizophrenia. Not all individuals, but some part. And again, this comes into how did these individuals develop? What were the events that led to an individual experiencing that disconnect between mind and body? What led to that condition in of itself? As a consequence of these recognition of variations, there's been an evolution of definitions of sex and gender. And I think I've talked about this before, but sex and gender as terms have been in use for hundreds of years, and they have evolved even from past definitions and kind of fluctuated over time. Um, Presently speaking, probably within the past 40 to 60 years, they were considered synonymous. They were used interchangeably. And as time went on and we started recognizing that there was this concept of gender identity compared to physical sex, we needed to use a term that was familiar and recognizable. So now we use sex as physical and gender as this concept of gender identity. And there is actually a link there to Merriam-Webster, who does a good job of filling in some of those things. I wanted to pull in this concept of brain sex and what is involved with this. Over to the right is an MRI function demonstration of a lot of the connections of the brain. And this is nowhere near even close to how many neurons are interacting with each other. This is an overall structure of these are the connections that we expect to have happen. And you can kind of see some of the structures, the ventricles, the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the cerebellum, and so forth. So, are there differences in brain structures based on sex? Well, it depends on your perspective, and I've brought that up before. The answer is yes and no, depending on what structures you're looking at. And yes, there are variations, and it's kind of more complicated than just saying, are there differences or there similarities? It depends on the structure you're looking at. It's looking at the development of the individual. And I listed out several articles that describe that. The first four are descriptions of, yes, there are differences in brain structures. The last one tries to make the argument that there isn't, and that the differences that we saw in the past is more based off of the size of the human brain, that males' brains on general tend to be larger than females' brains. And that the differences based off of sex is only about 1%. Now, if you think about 1% inside of a human brain, the human brain not being very large to begin with, but 1% can still be significant. There can still be a dimorphism that happens because of that 1%. Now, because there's these variations and natural statistical variations all along this, it's a trend. It's not definitively one brain is definitely male and the other one is definitely female. There is this slew of variation between that makes it more complicated. So a lot of neurologists and neurosurgeons in neuroscience basically wants to take this concept away from dimorphism and look at it as a mosaic, that various structures can evolve and develop differently inside of the brain. Are brains of transgender individuals similar to their gender identity? Again, it's yes and it's no. It's more complicated than that. And yes, there are variations. And here's again some structures that are journal articles that point to these concepts in of itself. I wish there was a great way to describe this in its entirety, but I think the best way to think about it is looking at it as a mosaic. The brain is not just one structure, but it's individual entities inside of that structure that develop and evolve based off of our own genetics and own environmental influences. So the concept of gender identity is complex. And even reducing our gender identity to just genetics or psychosocial conditions or environmental factors or social interactions is really quite impossible to narrow it down to just one thing. It's not just one thing. It's just like the journal articles say, it's not just one gene. As we have learned, there are dozens of genes that are involved in our development, and that's one of just the a set of complicated situations. What about these psychosocial interactions? Um, It isn't just a mental state or a mental illness. It's who these individuals are. It's how they grew up. It's how they developed. It's just that's part of their relationship of mind, body, and spirit. So the last slide, I think there's actually one more beyond this, is things that can affect our gender identity. So the very top of the list is differences of sexual development or intersex conditions and genetics. And this can be different than disorders of or different differences of sexual development. As I pointed to, schizophrenia and autism definitely have familial links or genetic links to them, but that's not always the case. There can be definitely environmental influences that happen during gestation that influences the development of these conditions. Why do we have one parent that develops schizophrenia, the child does not, and another child does? It's more complicated than just saying one thing leads to one other. We have noticed that there are situations of abuse that happens with individuals, neglect, maltreatment, and physical and sexual abuse or trauma. Um, there are situations where, for example, a young girl or a female assigned at birth can experience sexual abuse and subsequently develop um, gender dysphoria. The way they perceive themselves is different because of this traumatic event. And because of that, they want to self protect themselves. And as a consequence, they view being male as more protective. Um, that's not the only explanation. That's one of many. I wouldn't even say that is the definitive answer for an individual that this happens to, but it could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be just this concept of this individual trying to learn how to interact with this body and this mind and that relationship between the two of them. They are learning to cope with these mechanisms, and it's something that is going to happen throughout their entire life. Puberty can lead to some gender dysphoria. Physical and emotional changes that happen during puberty, as we all can attest to, or many of us can attest to, puberty is not fun. As these developments happen over the course of the teenage years, we have to adapt. We have to learn to try to cope with these. And if there is some other mechanism underlying this, where puberty becomes more traumatic, then that gender dysphoria can persist for an individual's entire life. Not always, because sometimes at the end of puberty or through puberty, gender dysphoria can resolve. There's other environmental exposures that can happen with this, like toxoplasma and steroids. And I point up the last topic of social, and I put a question mark next to it. And this is one that I think a lot of people have focus on, saying that a lot of the individuals that experience gender dysphoria or complications of gender identity, that is a social aspect of it, which may be a small part of an individual's experience, but at the same time, we have to look at all these other experiences that do happen. We have to make sure an individual is not being mistreated or that they do not experience sexual abuse. And how do we interact with an individual with schizophrenia or autism and help them differently than people who have a disorder or a difference of sexual development? So it's a very complicated topic and certainly something that needs to be addressed and studied further. As we go back to the slide at the very beginning, it becomes this relationship of mind and body that we're trying to work with and understand. That as we've understood more and more and more, we realize that there is a great diversity of individuals and humans throughout the world in relation to this. A lot of people have congruence of mind and body in terms of their sex and gender identity, which is great. I'm always excited to see that because these individuals are people who can learn and help those who are around them. People who experience gender dysphoria we need to help them understand themselves And that involves looking at all these various aspects, including even the social aspects of how this person may have developed this gender identity or just gender dysphoria. So the last slide is gender identity is a complex collection of characteristics that have intrinsic and extrinsic sources and influence. It's not just one thing. It's a collection of many things, and that gender identity does relate to our physical bodies, and it's not always congruent. The causes and associations with an individual should be approached individually. One person is different than another person, is different than another person, which should make a lot of sense. We are very unique individuals in this world, and we have a diverse collection of characteristics. And the last key point with this is be cautious with making assumptions. We as a society use physical appearance as surrogates for identifying sex and or gender. And unfortunately, this is not 100% accurate. Unless you have a specific imaging genome study or surgical encounter, we actually don't know or have a complete picture of someone's sex or gender identity. This is why it's important to ask, what is somebody's experience with this? How can we help learn and understand and ask appropriate questions so that we can better ourselves as a society? So I wanted to thank you for your time, and I will certainly make these slides available. Thank you.